Hello, I am back. The story today is The Scene Was Rockin', All Were Digging the Sounds by NidoranDuran. The summary is Mavis enters a new line of work, professional pornography, and her debut movie is a monster-themed shoot where a cute vampire goes through every other classic movie monster. She's sure it'll be a graveyard smash. Commission for Simo09. Chapter 1. I heard that I could get paid to suck humans, Mavis said. Looking up with starry eyes from the leather couch she sat on in the not entirely nice looking office. It was a sleazy back room. A casting couch. Mavis knew as much already, as much as she played innocent with it. And as vampire, I love to suck humans, and anything else too, if it has blood in it. This couch had been in enough videos she'd seen already to know what was up. One did not love for over 100 years and go through the decades-long puberty of a vampire without peeking in on pornography. She knew what was going on and how every innuendo she tossed out there came off. It was way more exciting for it. You get paid to suck humans, the director said, a smirking man sitting back with a smile, and to suck monsters. We're looking for a vampire girl who can be in a production with other monsters, and there'll be a human part. But if you want the job, you'll also have to show me you can suck well. Wide-eyed and still playing along with feigned gullibility, Mavis clapped her hands together in delight. I'm your girl. Holy rabies, this sounds great. Am I your first audition? Your neck doesn't look like it has any puncture marks in it. You would be so tired if you had girls sucking you all the time. This was almost too fun. The fact the camera was on her only made it more exciting. This was all blatant and cheesy, and she was happily along for the insane ride. The director rose up and walked towards Mavis, hands at his shorts. You won't be sucking my blood, girl, he said, and promptly shoved a long thick right into her face. Her eyes widened in shock, just long enough for Mavis to get to let the surprise sink in before she shoved his way into her mouth. No sense or shame behind it, just raw face fucking. With Mavis choking on the sudden surprise and dealing now with all the bizarre, confusing sensations that began to take hold of her. She didn't feel ready to deal with them all, but they were too abrupt and senseless for her to really know what else to do with it all. A hard plunge down into Mavis's throat brought as many surprises for the director as it did for Mavis. She didn't make a noise. There was some slurping, sure, the sound of her sucking dick as she held firm. All the squishy wet noises that should have come. But no choking, no gagging, no indication that having a cock down her throat was any kind of a problem at all. And Mavis held firm as she took it all. Like me. Resolute. It confused him, but he kept up his pace, thrusting away and wondered what he was missing. But Mavis remained steadfast, retaining her bearings until she got throat fucked. I'm just feeling sorry for Dennis's mom here. What she did was give a reckless, sloppy adoration of his cock. It was bigger than her husband's. Jonathan's was the only cock Mavis had ever blown. And this handedly put it to shame, as she did her best now to embrace all these weird and hazy desires, pleasures that didn't feel the least bit sensible or controlled. Her eyes were wide, lips firm, and she bobbled her head on even faster to punish her cute face and embrace the reckless pleasures to follow. There was absolutely nothing that seemed to be holding her back. Mavis knew everything she wanted to do, and she was ready to prove all of it. Like your mom. This spooky bitch has no gag reflex. The man groaned, voice lit up with a delighted shock as he plundered on forward, not sure what he was doing, what he was going to do with this information, but wanting to lose himself to it all, exploring deeper, hastier, losing all focus and restraint for the sake of wearing her down. Mavis was firm and unstoppable in her forward pushes. She knew she had the job, but she didn't let that slow down her reckless sucking. The sloppy adoration of this big dick coming on firmer and messier as she continued to show off everything she wanted to give him, savoring the pleasure and the excitement of outdooring his cock. Each sloppy, broad gesture showing off how much she loved this new line of work she was getting into. When he came, it was down Mavis's throat. She was a shaky, hazy wreck, struggling now to keep herself under some shred focus and control. But she failed miserably. Instead of getting her throat painted wide as the cock erupted down her gullet, and Mavis could not have been happier with this outcome. As the cock pulled back and spit dripped down her face, Mavis had a needy, wide-eyed look of excitement waiting. "Did I get the job?" she asked, peppy as could be. I think I like this kind of sucking even more." A squish of fingers against her small breasts looked all the more impressive when there seemed to be no fingers at all. The invisible man is molesting me. I don't know what he's going to do next," Mavis whined, sucking a nervous breath down as she leaned back against his chest, feeling the digits prodding and fondling, feeling the excitable attention he paid to her body wear her thoughts down more than she was really prepared to face. There wasn't much that Mavis could do about any of this treatment. She was stuck here, shifting about with a mess of nervous, cloying emotions all pushing against her at once. Griffin had found a strange little porn niche, and was more than a little surprised to find Dracula's daughter as the girl he shared a scene with. But he also had absolutely no reason to hold back, fondling the sweet girl he'd maybe been watching with a bit too much interest for quite some time, his hands all over her body now and fondling the helpless girl who gave herself up willingly to her father's friend and accepted the pleasures aching harder through her as she wriggled back and forth. Everything he did had to be played up for the camera in some way. Playing with her breast was easy enough. Lifting her up and into his arms was another. A floating dildo was the easiest way to make the movie, and the toy waved about in taunting delight before shoving itself up into Mavis, making her gasp as her arms rose up into the air. I'm not doing it, it's all him! She whined as her silent partner in the scene fucked her with the toy. It was a dizzy expression of so many feelings Mavis found herself utterly aflame with, loving the pleasures that hit her and savoring more and more the strange pulses of lust that hit so strongly. She wanted to keep leaning into all of them, giving up deeper to the pleasures and not caring about anything resembling sense. She just wanted to roll with this more to keep sinking deeper into the pleasure and to his fierce touch. The steady pump of the toy continued to shake her thoughts and test her limits, keeping Mavis hot and needy, twisting under the pressures he brought down upon her, knowing full well she was powerless against them. The pleasure here was all too good to deal with. She found herself eagerly sinking into it all, unraveling as desire hit her harder, messier. She wanted to cry out in shameless pleasure again and again as she gave up to it all, twisting under way too much attention for her own good. The toy fucked her harder, quicker. She'd never been this robe of her own body. Griffin tugged at one of her nipples and kept groping her, getting more intense. A pull at her hair followed next. Mavis was getting roughed up, and she could do nothing but take it. Like her mom, the helpless victim of a man whose invisibility became its own depraved little thrill for a porn viewing audience. But to her, won't someone help me? I can't stop this. She was having the time of her life, every moan rigging out louder and more feverish as she let herself go, letting the sinking of pleasure and heat keep pushing her limits, and she didn't want it to stop. All the pleasure and the heat that continued to wear down her brought with it the insane and shaky thrill of being fucked on camera, knowing that she was far out of her league, but in some insane way happier for that. She never wanted it more, never felt better about sinking so deep into this mess. It was almost too good to be true. The dripping need and wetness leaking from her desperate pussy made Mavis feel even more embarrassed, more compromised and helpless as each push made her struggle and shiver, made her whole body ache with the twisting, hopeless want of pure surrender. This all felt too good to be real, and yet everything Mavis did burned with a senseless inclination to keep giving up, to seek more and to crave it even harder. Vocal, shaky whines rang out with pride as she let herself go. There was nothing better than this. To orgasm on camera was a different experience than sucking dick had been. An experience she found herself oddly craving as she unraveled so hard for the attention and scrutiny of it all. She was overwhelmed, hot, shameless, loved every second of it, leaning back against Griffin as she pumped the toy slowly in and out of her still leaking hole, and admired how much of a wreck she looked like now. "I, Kevin Van Helsing, will slay you, foul demon," said the man who shoved himself harshly into Mavis's pussy. His thick cock, unwieldy and brutal as he took great delight in heaving into her, one hand on her throat, shoving down onto the bed while the other pinned her wrist down. You are mine now, vampire. I will make sure you play by slaying with my power, monster defeating cock. He wasn't the real Van Helsing. As far as Mavis could tell, his name really was Kevin, at least. But in his silly monster hunter getup, he provided the human scene in this porno. And fuck if he didn't do a good job. Another oversized cog, big enough to seriously challenge her senses and send her thoughts plunging into disarray. Mavis was just happy to let this happen, giving up with vocal joy and heaving. Needed to light the pleasure some fake hate sex between a hunter and his quarry sounded kind of silly to Mavis. but no more silly than any other bout of lunacy she found herself dealing with, so she didn't fight the opportunity at all. His dick was big, but why not let him fuck her senseless with it? You'll never beat me! I'm gonna drain your balls, and then I'm gonna drain your blood! Mavis shouted back. She was ready to have fun with this and throw her own cheese in for the sake of having a good time. When I break free, I'm going to make you regret crossing the Dracula family. We'll end your life for good. But her voice trembled and bucked with the searing throbs of pleasure that kept up their pace. It was almost too good for Mavis to deal with. Then her head spun and she tried to keep herself under some shred of control amid this whole mess. It was overbearing, but she found herself right there where she needed to be, enjoying these pleasures that keep hitting her. Not caring about restraint or sense while she took this all rougher, fiercer. The fake hunter brought her a pleasure she needed more than anything else, and Mavis was unstoppable. As she received it all, proud and steady, and showing her fangs as she saw an opening, snapping forward and biting him. She didn't do much more than break the skin. She could have drunk, but she held back, just simulating it with slopping noises and licks as he pinned her harder down against the bed. Her legs flew into the air as his savage thrust continued, but Mavis had her tight lock on. Slaps across her face didn't shake her either. The rapid acceleration of a wild, shameless hate fuck between vampire and vampire hunter played out with intense commotion. The bed struggling to keep steady as they went all out on each other. The scene hadn't demanded this much, but Mavis was all in, ready to plunge the scene into chaos and go out of control. And she challenged him to try and keep up with her. When he came, it was all with wild groans and a senseless, panicked feeling of intense frustrations. She'd drawn her co-star into method acting as he pulled back, shouting, "You bitch!" with much more reality to it than he would have liked. 2 puncture marks, dripping with blood, more blood and spit smeared all over the injury site, and Mavis was moaning in delight while baring her red fangs and coming hard from the thrill of his load shooting into her. Her confidence and her comfort were only climbing as he kept pushing deeper into these new forms of insanity, and Mavis didn't want it to stop. The swamp monster, who Mavis shared a scene with next, was still slimy and had bits of kelp still clinging to his body when he lifted her up and slammed her perky butt down onto his cock with one swift and utterly reckless motion. Mavis shrieked in surprise as he pulled her down, but all the wet, swampy sliminess ended up serving well as lube, making the shove of his fat prick into her unprepared back door much easier. Almost smooth as I went into your mom last night. There didn't feel like a shred of sense to any of this, but in a way that Mavis found herself oddly ready for. She was helplessly confused under all of this attention, her bodily tightening up and clenching with panic and utter frustration as she felt this merciless shove acclaim her. But at the same time, she was as ready as she could have ever been. Held aloft by the snarling, gill-clad fishman, who didn't say anything as he slammed into her. The noises he made were all airy hisses and not much more, and she left Mavis with plenty of dead air to got to fill up somehow. She felt it was easier then, and she would have feared to keep up that pace and make sure she wasn't getting her ass pounded to pure emptiness. You got your swamp slime off? You got your swamp slime all over my clothes. Please, slow down. You're too rough. Your monster cock feels like it's going to break me in half. She wasn't as good at acting agonized while secretly loving every second of this. Mavis found herself indulging in the most satisfying anal experience of her life here, and she didn't care about resisting these opportunities or holding back from the pleasures that took her by a storm. She was vocal and needy, a reckless mess, embracing all the pleasures and the frustrations that began to take her, and she wanted nothing more than to let them rule her now. Every thrust hastened her rapid descent. Savage thrust ran to bounce her up off his cock entirely as the sea monster used her without a care for anything but the chance to utterly ravage her body. Mavis was lost to all this commotion and this fever, and as she got louder, he fucked harder in an attempt to shut her up, and he couldn't express that with anything but more thrust. Problem was that harder fucking wasn't going to do a damn thing to keep Mavis quiet, and as she thrashed harder on through all these heavy spikes of pure bliss, falling further and further into a state of pure frustration, a fever and confusion that she was happy to just let rip her asunder, all of it at once, which meant it was time for a pivot. Will you take me back to your swamp with you and use me as your eternally young anal slave? Her eyes went cross. Pleasure suited her better. Indecent, plain bliss as she let the thrust push her limits harder, as she sank into a frustrated state of acceptance, too powerful and too aimless to know how to deal with. She knew only how to express her most shaky and shameless wants, pleasures, burning through her hotter, pulsating and demanding her absolute submission as she continued to fall deeper, and as she explored the idea of letting it all go. She didn't get an answer to that either, but she did get him to come on her ass. And perhaps more importantly, got to enjoy the most shameless, feral lust state inducing anal orgasm she'd ever felt, shrieking out in aimless joy, and she felt the pleasure, and come fill her up in equal pleasure, thrashing in his grasp, and showing off just how hopeless and raw and indecent she could get. Mavis stumbled then to the floor and began to feverishly worship the sea monster's cock, paying it hopeless, aimless love and devotion for all he just given her. Mavis was relieved to find that the mummy in her next scene wasn't Murray. That would have been weird, but at the same time, the more ancient Egyptian mummy whose massive cock slammed into her while his bandages unraveled from his body and bound her body was a kind of weird that she'd been far less ready for than silly, faithful expectations. With a needy shriek of surprise, her head rolled back as she stood bent forward, feet off the ground, wrists spread out, and held in place by bandages while she got absolutely ruined from behind and savored every shameless, feral second of this delight. Mavis tried to speak, but another bandage had her gagged. leaving her only able to whine and shiver as she stared at the cameras moving around, mumbling and whimpering as her legs dangled and shook all with each thrust in her snug hole. The cock she took was the biggest one she'd had yet, and she was in no way prepared to deal with all the chaotic swells of panic and pleasure that followed as she tried to. It was too much, excess in its most brutal form, challenging her to the idea that as she could handle any of this while fumbling through the senseless lust with no clear sense of how to actually do that. While he plundered the tight vampire and stretched her pussy out harder than she could handle, he spoke in swift, feverish ancient Egyptian, spitting degrading remarks about her that she didn't have a hope of understanding, but given the way he said them and the way he fucked her, she felt like she had a decent idea of the statements and sentiments involved. And she found herself all the more excited by that insanity, by the winding, hazy rush of emotions that kept up their pursuit. Mavis had no hope of keeping her thoughts straight now. She just sank deeper as the sex in each successive scene pushed her with much more intense fire to earn a sharper lesson about just how in over her head she truly was. Whether she wanted it to be steady for it or not, Mavis found herself hopelessly unable to keep her head on straight and continue to take this all with any reasonable pace. She came hard, eyes rolling back as the visible surge of maddening bliss burned across her body. She was overwhelmed by this pleasure, moaning out for it as she shook, as she trembled, as her body tightened up, and the joy of coming her brains out proved to not be the end of anything. Because the thrust only harshened up again as a wild slam into round 2 began up. And Mavis realized that not only was this mummy in for the long haul, but that was as long as he held onto her so tightly. There was nothing she could do but let him keep using her as a cock sleeve. A clunky robot shambled onto the set, and Mavis really wasn't sure what he could do as she sat there in patient confusion and slipped into position amid the director saying it was action. His midsection was a big blocky box, his head a bucket. Arms looking like flexible tubing for air conditioning more than anything else. It was silly and utterly ridiculous, and Mavis didn't have any clear idea on how he was going to even fuck her. As she watched with baffled amusement at his approach, wondering what she was in for. But then, she was grabbed, tucked up, and slammed against a piston-driven cock emerging from his midsection. And before Mavis knew what was going on, she was once more stuck in a position aloft in the air, legs dangling, arms held back. While she got utterly ruined, this time a huge mummy dick wasn't her trouble, but the fact this robot came on with an ersatz fucking machine, shamelessly brutalizing her body and relentlessly subjecting her to the wicked slams and reckless brutality that she was helpless against now. Holy rabies, how is this old bucket of balls able to fuck like this? She couldn't believe the pleasure and the fever that hit her, unprepared for just how merciless the fever and the frustration came on as the fucking machine, mounted onto a robot, began to work its utterly brutal magic upon her. But she knew that was right there. She was right where she wanted to be able to, wanted to be able to take it. Every sound out of Mavis's mouth was one of absolute ecstasy. and she received another truly shameless treatment, another unrelenting sensation of brutal treatment, and fire that kept her stuck in a feedback loop of lust and frustration. Whether she was ready for it or not, Mabel was going to get fucked, and her body was horribly unprepared to deal with all the wild feelings she gave up to. It was too much, but in the best of ways. The mechanical creaking and clanging of the piston drew on louder as the machine picked up, fucking Mavis deeper and rougher. But in turn, she was needier, a more helpless wreck, shrieking as she felt the unrelenting pleasures wear her down. Struggling now to make sense of feelings escalating beyond reason and keeping her in a state of wanton acceptance. Mavis didn't know how anyone was supposed to handle this, but she was happy to give up to it anyway, her orgasm overwhelming and truly brutal, sending her shrieking into a spiral of downward crashing that felt too grand to handle. But that wasn't enough. The thrust continued, and unlike with the mommy who wanted to fuck until he was done, Mavis was stuck in this position to be fucked until she was a babbling, fuck-addled mess who'd need to give up filming for a day over how much she'd been ravaged, which in some ways was maybe even more exciting for Mavis as she screamed, "Shut it off! Shut it off!" while wanting nothing more than for it to keep destroying her. When Mavis realized she was sharing a scene with Uncle Frank, yet again thrown for a weird loop, she took him aside and begged him to keep it quiet. She wasn't even against blowing her father's best friend. She just wanted it to be kept absolutely silent and never shared with any loving soul ever. Fortunately, Frank agreed with that assessment, and before she knew it, the scene was underway and Mavis was knelt down in front of the absolute monster of a man, faced with his huge cock and discovering something that was not at all ready to learn. Uncle Frank had a horse's cock. The doctor did some experimenting, he said, meek and apologetic about it, as his massive, twitching horsecock stood at full attention in front of Mavis. "If you're scared by it, we don't have to." But Mavis was seeing stars. With a feverish lunge forward, she sucked down a massive prick, forcing herself to deal with the most intense cock-sucking challenge she could ever faced. It felt too good to be true, and without a sense of focus or control, Mavis began to slobber down on every inch of Uncle Frank's horse cock. It was madness, sure, but a kind of madness that she felt oddly comfortable giving up to, throwing herself into the deep and slobbering all over every inch of it as she let messy, aimless pleasures get the better of her. It was too good to be true, and Mavis wanted nothing more than to be ruled now by her frenzied desires, and by aimless spikes of raw pleasure hitting with sudden fire and demanding that she let herself give in. Maybe she wasn't gagging on it, but Mabel was drooling up a storm as she forced her way down onto the cock, messily struggling and heaving as she pushed on harder, messier, her need getting the better of her, and demanding that she do exactly what she needed to do, no matter what that entailed. Mavis was a bit clueless as to how she was supposed to do this in any practical way, and it didn't matter. Practicality got in the way of pleasure, and Mavis wanted it and only to keep servicing, to slobber and drool and indulge in this massive cock. She didn't even care who it was attached to. This simply deserved to be worshipped. The frenzied, mindless cocksucking storm that Mavis worked up had all the cameramen floored, trying to find different angles to capture the indecent show she put on for them. especially once she began to suck from base to tip, forcefully slugging her face down onto every inch of oversized horse cock, mercilessly treating herself to the most raw and unbearable extent of pure pleasure that she could ever muster. It was too insane to be real, but there was nothing better and the pleasures were completely unstoppable. She wanted them all though, pushing harder, punishing herself, not caring where this went, but loving the chance to give up and give in. She was overjoyed by the opportunities that followed, by the utter madness that completely broke down her thoughts and left a dizzy, frenzied wreck too happy to think straight. Frank mumbled and shifted, amazed by the outburst of frantic adoration that Mavis threw herself into. Having no idea how to make any of this calm down. But it didn't matter, the pleasure here was too good to believe, and when he came it was all over. Not just all over her face or all over her throat, all over Mavis in general. First on the inside and overflowing from her mouth, then hosing down her face, her dress, her tie, her thighs, the floor around her, excessive volumes of cum, gushed out with more intensity than Mavis could believe. But she was a shrieking mess, begging for more. He took this monstrous load and discovered the utter bliss of being made a complete mess. I love this job, Mavis whined, shaking and twisting about under all the pleasure that kept hitting her. Sitting back in her cast chair with a smile on her face and a towel, she tried to clean all the cum from her uncle off her face. She didn't do a particularly good job at any of it. Dizzy and frustrated under the weirdness and frustration that ensued, but she found herself all too happy to let it all go. Who knew being important could be so fun? The director slipped up beside her, glad they're having fun. Mavis had shed her clothes so they could be cleaned, and he walked over to pinch at her puffy nipples and fill her up. We've got the big scenes still to come. These haven't been the big scenes yet? Wide-eyed and needy, Mavis stared up in delight at the director. Wow, these have all been so much fun. We've saved the biggest ones for last, he said, which reminds me, before you get totally trashed in the next scene, I think I could see you in my trailer again for a little while, so we can negotiate some contracts. Mavis wasn't dumb. She knew what he wanted, but she'd ended up so tightly wound and frantic after getting fucked that she was happy to accept the obvious bait. That sounds fun, he said, slipping out of the chair and heading off to the director's trailer to loudly ride his cock until production resumed again. Chapter 2, Loving the Knot. Mavis sat in the chair waiting for her next scene, reclined with a comfort and a calm that had just the slightest undercurrent to it of uncertainty. She sat and waited for her co-star, a magazine in her lap, to read up on while she waited, wondering where exactly said co-star was. Do you guys know when he's supposed to be here? She asked, a little bored and frustrated by the sheer absence of any response. She felt like she needed something, but kept sitting in unstimulated boredom, stuck waiting around and hoping something was going to come together. As she lingered, it felt like a weird joke and for how much fun she was having on set, even when she was besting the director's trailer for a little extra work. It felt like an infuriating modal momentum crash. Before anyone could answer or even really turn their head to look at her, tendrils seized her from around the corner and seized her back. Dragging her out of the chair, she yelped and hollered in sudden surprise and panic. Mavis had no chance to ready herself, no chance to prepare or protect from the suddenness of sweeping tentacles lifting her, getting in under the towel she had wrapped around her body and shoving it aside. What the hell is that? Gluck, 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 gluck. Whatever it was, it went straight down her fucking throat, challenging her to hold tight now through the utter bafflement and frustration of having the cock ravage her face. More tentacles seized her limbs, dragging her into the air and holding her spread out, face forward, face toward the camera. Mavis looked around her shoulder, all while the cock pounded into her mouth and she discovered what had been so eager to play with her. A giant, blobby green mass of tentacles, clearly not of this world, was her co-star for the scene, and the creature's one eye blinked in peering curiosity as he held onto her, keeping her tight in his grasp, limbs spread out, mouth receiving his cock. This had been a setup of some kind, but one that she had a hard time being mad about, and she received a shameless indulgence. The cock drilling her mouth and pushing her limits so readily. Its best excesses were upon her. This was a scene, and she was a star of it. Being confused wouldn't do Mavis a lick of good, so she prepared herself, head rocking to meet the big dick that forced its way into her mouth, lovingly gagging it down and forcing herself into a state of creamy delirium too wild to help. She was happy to roll with this, happy to feel the depths of pure satisfaction and strangeness that hit her. A strike of pure sensation and panic that she was all too eager to lose herself to once she got going. Meeting the face fucker was step one to getting what she wanted, as her pussy waited in impatient panic. She didn't get what she wanted yet. The tentacle kept fucking her mouth, leaving her wanting more, and spit ran down her chin. Her twat dripped with hopeless arousal too. She showed off the wild desperation that so immediately swept through her. Short order transitioning from boredom into feverish need and desire so quickly that almost defied sense. Mavis wanted this, and all of its worst needs pushed her into a state much too dreamy and panicked to know what to do with. Her body throbbed and ached for much of these sweeping rushes of relief, and she felt certain now of how good this could all feel, and how wildly it could tear through her. The thrusts were brutal and unstoppable, winding up Mavis's thoughts, keeping them locked in a weird, foggy mess she didn't know how to answer. So much was happening, and it pushed her deeper, made her whole body tighten up as surprise and want, and he'd all nagged at her thoughts. Mavis wasn't prepared to face all of this, but she knew what she wanted to, sinking into a strange state of hunger that demanded that she give up. She didn't have a choice, especially with a camera on her. Mavis accepted the role, accepted the pressure, breathing in wild and hopeless need back and forth through the stormy rush of heat that swept up across her body. She wanted it all so badly, and nothing could now keep her from giving up fully. The thrill, delights, and desires tearing across her thoughts and rendering her vision. It was a pretty fun trick. They really got Mavis with this one, and she couldn't be mad about it. And she got the throat funk of a lifetime. The tentacle had the ability to move in ways a normal penis couldn't, and it used every last bit of that ability in using and dominating her, leaving her head to spin in dizzy, drunken fever. And she got pushed to the limit. It was a lot. But its deepest excesses felt so good that she didn't care. Thrown deeper into pleasures too stormy and chaotic to be able to grasp. Every second of this wild heat demanding more from her, as long as she could keep giving right now. Keep giving in. Mavis didn't know why any of this could be a problem, and her readiness to burn only grew hotter. as she embraced what could wash over her. It was a lot, but its hottest excesses kept her burning, kept her bright. Every passing second of this hazy weirdness pushed her further. And Mavis was happy the sun come and collapse, eager to learn her way through complete fucking madness. Being choked out by a tentacle dick wasn't what Mavis expected from her this scene, but then nothing had really been all that sensible so far. Maybe it stood to reason that she'd be on the receiving end of something that is crazy, that she'd be burning up bright and hot and completely detached from sense. Her dripping, pleading pussy needed some relief, but she wasn't getting it. She was just getting used harder, getting pounded until thought drifted away, and all that remained was hopeless surrender. A greedy abandon that had her feeling like a glorified sex toy, and perhaps more excitingly so than she could have ever imagined. Its deepest, wildest brutalities evoked rushes of sensation and panic that coursed through her veins with thunderous intent, pushing her limits further and further along. Well, for something so brilliant and so fierce that she couldn't imagine not craving more of it. She may not have gone off from this, but he did. As the space alien withdrew his cock from her mouth, the eruption of cum all over her face had her sing out in joy. "It's so much!" she grasped, as the green ting spunk shot out in quantities that defied all sense and shook her even harder. She never felt so overwhelmed or overjoyed. These deep and pulsating needs inducing pleasures, to grant, to understand. It left her face caked in excessive gooey mess, but that felt like only the beginning of something beautiful. She doubled down in ready surrender for more of what was to come. Two tentacles rammed without warning right up into her holes. Mavis shrieked out in sudden shock at the rough double penetration, at the feeling of wanton panic slamming down into her. She had no time at all to respond to it, as her twisting form shuddered under this panic. But the raw, feverish indulgences left her no time to care either. She found herself in a position here of completely overwhelmed surrender and throbbing ecstasy. The pulsating heat of her body meeting the demands of this wild creature, now with little how to respond to him. The tentacles filled her, but with her mouth open and her body still suspended, she didn't have anything to do but howl in pleasure. The tendril she just sucked off didn't go far though. It rubbed and smacked against her face, and she tried to catch it with her tongue, licking at where she could. And paying it all the praise she was capable of. The whole situation she was stuck in now felt far too wild and satisfying to be able to hold on to, and Mavis was divorced from all sense as she threw herself into it. As she savored every single second of hopeless surrender, pushing her deeper over the edge. "This feels so good! Fuck this tight earthling body!" She didn't know how any of this was happening or how to control herself, but she was all too happy to keep losing control to it, giving up fully and embracing the idea that she really needed was to let go. Mavis felt too good, felt so sublimely overwhelmed, and each step of the way was simply another chance to fall even deeper. The monster didn't respond. He didn't have much weight to, as he plundered her holes and fucked her rougher and wilder, pushing Mavis's body to the limit and indulging without a shred of care or calm. Simply lost in the pursuit of using her so thoroughly and so utterly that she didn't have a thought left in her mind. Wildest, deepest fevers were pushing her far over the line. Mavis felt amazing. The deepening haze of giving in like this brought on so many things she was completely unprepared for. The wild truths burning her up were pure ecstasy. Each step of the way, she felt better and hotter about what she was doing. Giving in was pure joy. She knew she needed to keep seeking out more. Knew there was no greater satisfaction now than losing all sense, but there didn't need to be any. "Flood me with your cum," she screamed. A hopeless wreck trembling about, back and forth, jerked around by so many more emotions and thoughts that she could healthily deal with. Too much in the best of ways, and everything being done to her kept her hungry for more, kept her holes ready, greedy, getting filled to the brim and fucked into submission. As long as she could get what she needed with unwavering joy. She needn't worry about a damn thing, thrown into the deep end and savoring just how wild these pleasures. Okay, she lost herself to all of it. These tentacles weren't the biggest dick she handled in the filming of this movie, but they were so much more intense than she was built to handle, and her hazy moans spun off into a million directions. She took all of it on, learning how amazing it could feel to let fully go. It didn't need to make sense, it just had to push her limits, just had to make her burn for the sweet throbbing thrill of coming undone at the seams. She felt due for a rash, hopeless and frantic, completely lost the brilliant, burning ecstasy of letting it all go. There was nothing more exciting than burning up under all this pressure. Its molten haze driving Mavis hard over the edge. As she came, it was a big, grand rush of utter surrender, thrashing heat and hopeless bliss, hitting her square on as the cocks erupted in both her holes at once, shrieking out in surprise and surrender. She let everything push her to the brink, amazed by just how intense it was, not to mention how much cum there was. She felt full, her guts flooded with spunk, womb filled up, too. She had no idea how much alien cum could take, but that didn't matter. She hung in trembling, twitching surrender, blissed out of her mind and going limp as the scene ended with her in a state of searing euphoria. Not sure how anything could top this. After the space alien tentacle fiasco, Mavis was certain that they weren't gonna pull another surprise co-star jump. That would have been ridiculous as she walked on set and prepared for a weird surprise only to find there wasn't one. For as little as that may have actually gotten in the way of anything, that there was plenty of invisible lovers or weird surprises that could have tricked her. Anything that wasn't another pouncing. But not only she was due a pouncing, the pouncing was this time far more literal than she was ready for. A big mess of fur and flesh throwing its weight right at her and driving her to the floor without a hope of responding in time to what ensued. She had no time at all to respond to this with a shred of sanity or reason as a big, burly werewolf threw himself at her, the brush of fur against her neck giving her a moment's panic, which formed just enough time for her to know something was wrong. Just a big, fat wolf cock rammed into her cunt. "What the fuck?" Mavis shrieked. As the most primal worries came over her, she tried to say more, but her furry hand clasped over her mouth and silenced her with brutal efficiency, keeping her quiet as shameless slams forward stuffed her twat as harshly and as thoroughly as the beast atop her could muster. Mavis had no time at all to respond to this treatment as the werewolf railed her with a brutal, greedy intent, the bulb of his knot waiting and grinding up against her pussy lips. And with each wicket it slammed forward, promising her complete doom. She squirmed about, trying to get out from under him, but the reckless thrusts persevered. Quiet down, bloodsucker. It's all for the camera. The wolf growled, the loud and smug and completely devoid of restraint. The directors wanted to keep me as a surprise. The last scene for you is to make a toothy slut beg for a werewolf dick. Just what a leech like you was waiting for, I bet. The rugged and bulky wolf man had zero control or restraint, his blistering pace reducing Mavis's thoughts to mush in seconds as he flattened her resistance. He was in control here. She'd find nothing but pure surrender no matter what she did, no matter how much these dizzy, intoxicating spells of panic struck her so harshly. The storied and lengthy history of the vampire-werewolf rivalry ran so deep and so thorough that the director put no thought into context for it. It was blatant. The two races had been at odds for so long that even the long-lived vampires couldn't say for certain where it started. So that was definitely the fault of the werewolves, and it become more of a formality over the past few decades. But when it came to the idea of a vampire begging for a wolf dick, such a thought was absolutely not acceptable. And yet the beast was hammering into Mavis, drilling her pussy and refusing to hold back from what he was after. His utterly chaotic sense of vigor, force driving her into a state of gasping panic so thoroughly hopeless that she didn't understand how to come back up from it. Her eyes were visible to the camera, and as the big canine cock ravaged her snug twat, she didn't have any way to deny that this felt amazing. Was it the best thing she'd felt this whole time? It almost didn't matter for how intensely this took her by storm. It was, in that moment, pure ecstasy. Every pale slut I fuck says the same thing. They swear they won't be a vampire's cum dumpster, but then they'll beg for my knot. Is that going to be you? Is Dracula's own cunt of a daughter going to beg for a big bad wolf to knot her and fill her up? His pride and his ferocity proved overwhelming, but his smugness was something Mavis couldn't argue against, because he had every right to be in control when he was pushing her to the limit this hard. Well, as Mavis was to admit it, she felt incredible. The racing and heat and raw fever of his thrust pushing her into a state of merciless surrender was much too one time, and baffled to be able to control. It was too much. Its deepest excesses driving her to lose all focus and control as she fell lower. Her pussy clenched down a needy hunger around his cock. Giving up to the idea of raw submission with little regard for sanity. Its worst demands pushed her to the breaking limit. It made her body ache and sing for this bliss. It was ferocious, showing off a brutality and a hunger that she didn't have a prayer of fighting off. Everything about it drove her to the state she wasn't ready to be in. But which scene after scene of utter surrender to dig after dig had left her incapable of fighting off. She needed this with the most reckless and chaotic of joys. She took this crash, bliss plunging her into a place where, whether she wanted to admit it or not, she loved everything he did to her. The hastening throws and the steady drunken heaving of her body back and forth, induced feelings inside of Mavis so one-sided and so hopeless that she had no hope of resisting them. The hand on her mouth still silenced her fully, still made her struggle under pressures too wicked to deal with, driving her over the line and ultimately down into a crash of pure sensation. Her body sang out in joy as it climaxed, even if she couldn't say as much, held firmly in place and mumbled through these drunk, dizzy ecstasies. It pushed her over the line, drove her into a space of pure submission, too feverish and reckless to understand any further. Whether she wanted this or not, her pussy clamped down and begged for something, and it didn't get the knot, but at least she got pumped full of jizz instead. Nils didn't have a moment to think about what happened either. The werewolf recklessly lifting her up and pushing her harder into submission as he pushed on without restraint. He knew what he wanted, and this pursuit of it was absolute as he hoisted her into his arms. He slammed her back down onto his dick again, hands under his legs as he impaled her ass with his cock. Do you like huge wolf dicks? He growled, bouncing her up and down his shaft as he clammed her ass without mercy. Unable to fight off the truth, Mavis slurred out a drunk, dizzy yes. As she gave herself fully, she wasn't proud of it, but as her quivering twat leaked with wolf spunk, she didn't feel she was strong enough to fight it. Didn't think she could possibly pretend she felt any different. You're still a mangy mutt who doesn't deserve to fuck. That earned her smack across the ass and a hard slam forward. The worm veered off into quivering heat as she continued to accept his brutality. Paul was in this high pressure situation, wishing she was sturdier, wishing she felt more capable of fighting off these feelings, if only as a matter of pride. Every leech whore is the same way. I wonder what it's about a nut that makes you all bend over and run out of insults. What? You're not gonna tell me I have fleas? Not gonna say I'd make a cute pet? No, of course not, because given a choice, I bet I could slap a collar on you and keep you around my house as a pet bitch. And you bark on command. Go on little bloodsucker. Bark for me if you want me to keep fucking your ass. He was pointed, direct. He threw his vulgar words into a fever much too wicked for Mavis to resist. She barked, with cameras on her. She barked as loudly as she could. Eyes rolling back as she succumbed to these shaky emotions, lost the pleasures. She didn't know how to resist. It was bland, and now this entire porn shoot had been a setup. That the only choice before her was one that involved hopelessly accepting that she was destined to surrender to this pure madness. It pushed her limits harder, drove her into a frenzied state so baffling and wicked that all she could do was keep taking it, letting this wolf use her holes and push her to the brink again and again. A masterful pushes and prods into a hypersexual fever and outrageous surrender were so swift and smooth that she didn't know how to wrap her head around any of it. She simply knew that with every savage slam of her ass, she lost herself more. I want you to rearrange my guts with your huge wolf dick, she confessed, tongue growing out of her mouth as she let these desires take her. It was madness, but she never felt happier to lose her mind, never wanted more than she did right now to simply break down into a hazy bush of confusion and fever. She didn't care about holding back, didn't care about what she had to do to get what she wanted. True to this bee's every word. Mavis was ready to do anything and everything she had to do if it meant she could get fucked harder. The raw brutality behind his throats pushed Mavis into a place she couldn't comprehend in the least. Its worst excesses had come brilliantly into focus, and she didn't understand how she could possibly handle the raw, wild feelings that kept her stuck in place. Another orgasm bubbled up inside of her, boiling fever and panic pushing her to the breaking point, and she gave up to it. She felt better than words could process, erupting with wild, shaky joy and a hopeless rush of utter satisfaction as she gave in. She broke down, a babbling wreck, heaving and thrashing under the weight of this wild madness, knowing only that this felt too good to possibly resist. She craved it all, understanding few things but breaking down with babbling joy. As her orgasm ripped through her, the werewolf held her down on his claw, probably lifted and proudly floated her ass, filling her bowels up with spunk and sating his wicked greed as thoroughly as he could. that would have been enough, would have been plenty to drill home his message and prove his supremacy to Mavis so thoroughly that she'd be left a cross-eyed mess the rest of her life. But even still, it simply wasn't enough. Reaching further inward, he used his grip on her legs to hook beneath, under them, folding her in half and locking his hands behind her back, and she lifted her ass up off his cock and held her perilously, in the full Nelson position, hollow and with the sea dripping out of both holes. Beg me to not your pussy. Please, not my pussy. Beg me to breed your slutty vampire cut. Breed my slutty vampire cut. Say you're a cum rag for werewolves. I'm a cum rag for all werewolves. I'm a pale leech slut who's tired of sucking blood and just wants to suck fat wolf cocks. She broke down, heaving and thrashing, lost to the mind-breaking joy of pleasure so intense that every scene she starred in with every other monster felt like a distant memory now. She was a mess, crashing headlong into surrendering chaos, but she refused to look back. Good girl. The wolfman said with as much dismissive, callous mockery as he could, slamming her down onto his cock again, lifting her up and down rather than thrusting, shooting her like a living fleshlight, or an unliving fleshlight. In this case, with each slam down, he had all the leverage in the full Nelson hold to do whatever he wanted to her, and his reckless, brutal speed was every bit as brutal and shameless as he could muster. Challenging Mavis to hold herself together while leaving her no time to handle it. Her screams of raw ecstasy filled the air, refusing to leave a moment's silence as she explored these wild depths, completely incapable of holding on to control now. She was just lost. She was lost, hopeless, filled of hungers too wild to grasp, wondering how to deal with her emotions and slipping further away from them by the second. The deepest, most hopeless ecstasies may lay ripe within her now. She felt happy to abandon all sense and dignity to keep falling into them, to deepen her haze and surrender all reason to something so wicked and so downright vile. It didn't make a lot of sense, but its illogic only furthered her crash, brought her a guiltless thrill she could savor as much as he wanted. How could she feel bad when her twat was stretched and stuffed with dick? Sure, it was a wolf dick, but she was only barely cognizant enough of how much that should have been a problem. Lost in the aimless thrill of getting drilled much too harshly to mind what thrills tore her apart. It was depraved and wicked in all the purest and satisfying of ways. And her deepening exploration of this wild panic made her crave something she didn't care about resisting now. It was too good, too much. With every slam down and onto his dick, she completely could feel his knot. Feeling him barely hold back from ramming her all the way down and ruining her completely. It was so good that she couldn't keep her head on straight. Another leech slut broken in. The wolfman roared, proud of how thoroughly Mavis was losing herself, knowing he had her in a position now so thoroughly submissive that all he had to do was wrap up the scene. Not even acknowledging the camera, he dismissed it, his attention solely on Mavis and on breaking her down. He accomplished that mission with ruthless efficiency. She was stuck here, completely unable to articulate a coherent thought or act against these crushing heats. tides of lust that kept her flailing about and aimlessly drifting through sense. But now you get to feel that no. Yes, do it! She screamed. Mavis could have gotten knocked up here, and she would have been happy with it, at least in this one singular moment of utter desperation. Nothing else mattered to her, and she was happy to crash headlong into the bliss of another wicked that broke down her thoughts and reduced her to fuck meat. She'd been brought into point just to run a gauntlet of monsters. Before being used to prove that the werewolf was the mightiest of it all. But she couldn't be mad. She could only ache as her pleading, wanton cold, begged for that final shove. His knock was everything she wanted it to be. A bit more cognizant, a bit deeper inside of her, but also an extra thick plug inflated further. Locking himself inside of her, she broke, eyes rolling again, drooling and babbling in fuck-addled ecstasy. She'd never felt anything like this, and Mavis was certain she didn't want to ever feel sex that wasn't this good again. Which came in with calls she didn't know how to sort out, but for the moment it didn't matter. Hugh let go of her, let her collapse to the ground, face down on the floor, as high up in the air, not locking her in place, on his dick as the camera zoomed in on the hopeless wreckage of their star. Goodbye.